So, the PRT and the somatic tracking and Alan Gordon's section of work, I was noticing it making a difference, but it wasn't curing me. And I was still seeing multiple specialists to try to track down. And I actually worked with a pelvic floor specialist, and they helped me to recognize that I was actually doing something improperly muscularly inside my body, but also that there wasn't something wrong with me. There wasn't any damage in me.
Welcome to The Story Behind the Symptoms, a podcast from Symptomatic.me. Your host is David Clark, MD, a board-certified gastroenterologist who successfully diagnosed and treated over 7,000 patients with neuroplastic pain or illness. Each episode, we dive into our guests' life experiences to uncover the deeper causes of their symptoms. By listening to their story, you will gain insights that advance your own journey towards knowledge that becomes healing.
Hello, and welcome to the Story Behind the Symptoms podcast. I am your host, Dr. David Clark, and in this podcast, we talk to people who have experienced neuroplastic symptoms, about where they might have started from, what their course has been over time, and how they found their way toward recovery. And my guest today is Stephen Fletcher. And Stephen, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name's Stephen Fletcher. I'm a licensed massage therapist. I'm currently living in Bellingham, Washington. I grew up in Vermont. I've lived both in Maine and Oregon. And, I know I can go on and talk for too long sometimes. It initially was, as the research seeped into my head and I searched and read and paid attention and did everything, it actually became clear to me that I've had 30 years of symptoms. And I grew up in a place where we would suppress that and lie about it and hide it and, shut down and say that, oh, that wasn't happening. But getting into the research, I've been able to see that it was actually a continuous train. And, neuroplastic symptoms would shift and change, but until being exposed to Howard Schubiner's work and EAET, it was always chronically something for 30 years. And I never even realized what life could be like without constant symptoms.
How old were you, Stephen, when your symptoms began, and what were they?
Technically, even after I turned off my chronic pain and my chronic IBS and my PTSD, I continued doing like the EAT work, even when I was asymptomatic, and it brought me back to events prior to me having really noticeable symptoms. So the first events that started mild things for me were actually in infancy, toddlerhood. But the main onset that was medically observable, if you will, was around 8 years old. I started having upset tummy, IBS, acid reflux, and anxiety, which was not understood, and PTSD, dissociative symptoms. The first places that it was really minor pain in my abdomen and pelvic floor spasms in the 8 to 9-year-old range. And then I had like a legitimate structural back injury at 14 years old. And that precipitated the chronic low back pain, which was off and on and largely on for me from then until just about 2 years ago. I've been basically totally cured for almost 2 years ago, like this week, roughly, actually. I developed severe IBS in my teens. I don't know if it's a TMI. I remember in my teens and 20s bringing 5 or 10 pairs of underwear to work, just to be able to hide what was going on and to maintain a normal level of function. And over time, more events happened. I had structural injuries such as, motorcycle accidents or car accidents or work accidents. So I eventually developed, bilateral paresthesia, what are we going to call it? Carpal tunnel-like symptoms. I used to have total numbness in both wrists and forearms. I eventually developed intensive sciatica mimicking that eventually became bilateral. So of course it, didn't continue to be structural. I had some motorcycle accidents in my 30s, and that led to severe chronic neck pain I had some brain injuries from those motorcycle accidents, so I developed migraines and had headaches. I had visual disturbances and issues and memory loss.
Goodness,
I
that's, you're
developed
ranging
cancer.
over your entire body.
Yeah,
Did
when
any of the medical professionals that you saw over the years recognize that there might be a neuroplastic contribution, a mind to body contribution to these symptoms? Anybody present that idea to you along the way?
absolutely no one. I've had double-digit number of doctors and specialists who said, "This is gonna be your life. You're not gonna get better." It became a regular. I've had tens of physical therapists, less 5 to 10 acupuncturists. I've probably done 400 acupuncture sessions after I recovered from cancer. I started seeing chiropractic when I was 14 years old. I've paid out of pocket for 6 or 7 different naturopaths. I had a medical bankruptcy due to these types of things. I've had osteopaths, gastroenterologists. I was highly gluten sensitive for about 12 or 14 years, and the AET turned that off literally in 24 hours. I now eat gluten every day. And
It's just appalling to hear stories like this. And at our conference that we have annually this year in Boulder, Colorado, September of 2025, I asked people to, by show of hands, how many of them had suffered neuroplastic symptoms for at least 10 years before they found um, a solution. And it was probably 100 people, which is just appalling. You would never see that in an audience of people with diabetes or heart disease or cancer or Parkinson's. The system is very effective at helping people with those conditions. Nobody's going to wait um, 10 days after they first present themselves for care to get appropriate treatment, let alone 10 years. Obviously, the ATNS is working very hard to change that situation so that everybody becomes aware that a mind to body process should be considered in virtually any symptom, but especially ones that don't have a well-defined structural or organ problem associated with it. But I'm curious now, when you finally did find your way to concepts that began to alleviate your symptoms, what were the ideas that most resonated for you, that made the most sense, that seemed to be the most helpful?
I mean, after curing myself using Howard's Unlearn Your Pain book and the Curable
I
program.
mean, before curing yourself, the ideas that helped you to find relief for your symptoms.
Yep. I set a timeline a couple of years ago and said, this year, in 12 months, I will get better or I will stop suffering. And so I spent everything and continued to work with as many specialists as I could find. And the thing that really actually led me was I was looking at a Hakomi book, which is a form of psychotherapy. And Hakomi has the words in there for somatic tracking. And I had a client who I brought that up to, because I'm a massage therapist, and they had just heard of somatic tracking from their physical therapist in Australia, who referenced Alan Gordon's book, The Way Out. So that was the very first time that I got exposed to any of this stuff. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, and did the somatic tracking help you?
It did. Yep. It immediately began to make an observable difference in the pain levels. I was in get up in the morning and lie in the shower sobbing, writhing in pain for an hour and a half. And then I could get up and kind of do my day. So it immediately made noticeable differences in my acute levels of pain specifically. It wasn't making an effect necessarily on my other neuroplastic symptoms, but it was an immediate noticeable effect. And I used to be a laboratory scientist. I used to want to be a physics professor. I used to study quantum physics. So seeing how verifiably peer-reviewed, data-based all of this stuff was, I just said, I didn't understand what was going on. This is better science than anyone's presented me. independent of what my experience is, this is better science than anything I've seen searching for decades. I'm going to give it everything I've got, because I've only at that time said I've got 6 more months of me trying before I'm no longer going to suffer anymore.
Okay,
And so,
so that led to other ideas for you then. Which were the ones that you found helpful? And I guess we should, for people that are new to this, mention that somatic tracking is a process of noticing your symptoms, being aware of them, but trying to remove the emotional component to them, particularly the fear, and then to shift your attention to what might actually be going on in your mind that is producing them. Recognizing, for example, that symptoms in the body that don't have a good explanation with respect to structural damage or organ disease can actually be a form of communication from the mind. And if we can try to understand what the mind is trying to tell us, what it is about our lives that we are experiencing distress about, that this can actually begin to alleviate the pain or other symptom, because we're not focusing on the symptom itself. We're not having fear of permanent disability or bodily damage from that symptom. We're instead thinking about it as a form of communication and then trying to understand what that message is. So what else did you find that was beneficial for you?
yep. So, the PRT and the somatic tracking and Alan Gordon's section of work, I was noticing it making a difference, but it wasn't curing me. And I was still seeing multiple specialists to try to track down. And I actually worked with a pelvic floor specialist, and they helped me to recognize that I was actually doing something improperly muscularly inside my body, but also that there wasn't something wrong with me. There wasn't any damage in me. And around that time, I think I watched the Pain Brain documentary with Alan Gordon. And one of the things he said in there was, he said, for the people who weren't sure if they had neuroplastic pain, he says, go talk to Howard. And so that's when I found Howard Schubiner. And I, voraciously just went through videos and did the Unlearn Your Pain process and meditated and somatically tracked. I used the Curable app to help me with meditations and to learn all the different pieces. And I watched the This Might Hurt documentary. And right about the time that I got to the sections around doing EAET, and I had tracked back in pictures and writings of myself all the way back to like 8 years old, and I could see the definitive line where I changed, both visually and in writing. And so I was able to be like, no, I changed discreetly from a couple of days to a couple of days. There was a discrete quantum event where my health changed. And so it all just was like, this is all very real. So November of 2023, I finally had worked myself up to and did a number of meditations in the morning and got myself ready, and then did a self-guided EAET session. And my mother died when I was 14 years old, and I was literally tortured in my sleep as a child by my brother and gaslit until my family figured it out. Like, he would literally cause me bleeding and pain in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. And then my mother died years later. And so all the meditative processes and the guidance of Unlearn Your Pain indicated that at least the pivotal one was my mother dying. And I'd done 10 or 15 years of therapy, always therapists being like, you're healthy, you're well, you have good skills. And I was like, I know, but there's a hidden piece going on in my brain that's real, and it's affecting everything. And I'd intuited that for a long time. And then EAET, the key for me was I knew I was supposed to be feeling emotionally angry at my mother for dying. Emotions and feelings are not logical. They're just a thing that's a part of our biology. And so I knew I was,
They're always real, they're always valid, but sometimes we learn when we're young to bury them somewhere.
yeah. And so I just, I did. I got really afraid, the EAT process of expressing anger towards my mom. I limbically went back to the event of her dying, and I got enragingly mad. I got really mad at her in my imagination. in that experience. And I even coalesced my anger into like a supernova of light, and I obliterated my mother right when she died for what she had done to my emotive body. And then that led into, instead of shame for feeling angry, a suppression, I actually felt guilt finally, just for that act in the moment of being angry. And then I learned to finally grieve. Like when my mother died, I didn't cry for 18 months was the first time. It was repressed. I'd already learned to repress that kind of stuff. And then I could feel the real compassion for what had happened to me in the 30 years of suffering and disease and gaslighting and being told I would be like that forever. And then I could spread the compassion to her.
So,
When I
Stephen, let
woke up
me
the next day, my IBS was gone. My chronic abdominal 9 out of 10 pelvic floor pain that'd been there nonstop for over 10 years, it was all gone.
Yeah, it's just amazing what the mind can do to the body and how emotions can be expressed via the body when they don't have an outlet in our cognitive awareness or in words. So was the anger towards your mom, was that just simply about her dying, or was it about ways in which she could have been more supportive to you when you were growing up?
For that exact event of when she died when I was 14, it was just angry at her for dying. But after getting cured, I continued to meditate daily and periodically do EAT things around things that I was not even having symptoms around, but my subconscious finally let me start to remember events earlier than 14.
Mm-hmm.
And so it brought me back to, eventually I got back to about, we'll say like 8 years old or 9 or 10. And there was an event with my family where I was not allowed to go on the school bus because I wasn't wearing a jacket, and I lived in Vermont and it was cold. And the school said, you have to wear a jacket. And my parents they felt powerless. They were like, we are too poor. You have to go on this school bus. You have to go to school. We love you. We wish we could do different, but we can't. And so that was an event where I was really angry about that, but I suppressed it.
Yeah, no,
And
that's
then
humiliating, obviously, and in front of all your peers.
yeah. And then after continuing to meditate, then I got back to a memory at about 6 or 7 years old, a couple years earlier, where I was a little kid who was going to graduate early from kindergarten from preschool and go to kindergarten like a year early. So I was really proud, and I was finally going to get to go to school like all the adults. And we were going into a Woolworth store, the old department stores, because we were going to get me school supplies. And there was a little turnstile you'd walk by where there was a food court. And I was really hungry. I was, 6 or 7, a little boy. It was the evening. It was after work. My mother was taking me. And we walked through the turnstile because I was like, I'm hungry. And she's like, we can't afford that. School right now is more important. You getting your school supplies is more important than eating right now because we can't afford it. I'm sorry. So it was another powerless event on my mom's part where it didn't make sense to be angry at her. And so I suppressed the anger then. And then 6 or 8 months later, almost a year later, my brain eventually let me get back to, much, much earlier, where there was a less visual memory, but my brother used to wait till people couldn't see, and then he would physically attack me and beat me, even as a little child. And so that was I think where I first learned to have a hypersensitive nervous system to be able to make noise to try to get help. And there were obviously times where my mom didn't come help me because maybe she didn't hear or something like that. And I was really angry, and I was just a little kid. And so
All right.
feel in
Yeah, a
my
couple
experience.
of things we need to follow up on here a little bit. First of all, if you could share your mother's cause of death.
My mother had non-classic chronic migraines for about 7 years, and then developed bone cancer. And then after the bone cancer, I think it metastatized and became like a stomach or abdominal cancer. And she was purportedly bipolar. And I admit, me personally, at this point, looking back through images, words, events, and everyone's events, I'm like, she had severe mind-body syndrome.
And did this affect how she interacted with you? Was she able to perhaps not protect you from your brother as much as someone else might have, someone else who wasn't suffering from these conditions?
And yeah, and and there was also the, like, I guess in a sense, the, like, shame and anger that I couldn't help her. Because I often make the serious joke that when I was a kid, I'd get up in the morning and my mom would be lying underneath the kitchen table, writhing in pain. I'd get ready for school. I'd go to school and come back, and there she still was. She was extremely ill from about 8 years old to 14 when she died. 8 years of my
And
age to
was that pain from the cancer, or was it from the migraines, or from her mind-body condition?
migraines, mind body. She went to like the Diamond Headache Clinic in Chicago in the late 90s, and insurance companies spent like $3 million on her over time. So we tried, and no one ever, neuroplastic. No one could find anything wrong with her over and
Okay.
over and over again, but her symptoms just progressed.
All right. Yeah, I can recall many, many patients over the years who were in home situations where a family member had, particularly a parent, had needs that were assumed by the child, that the child would feel responsible for meeting the needs of the parent. They became very focused on doing whatever they could to help the parent. And of course, being a child, you can't fix most of the things that are going wrong with a parent. And consequently, people feel like they're failures or they're second-rate human beings, or in the worst cases, they feel worthless, that they're not able to solve the problems that they see in front of them with people that they obviously care tremendously about. But at the same time, the beatings from your brother are going to be contributing to that. They also make a person feel like they don't deserve any better, and that just compounds the misery and the harm to the self-esteem and the inclination to be very focused on details, to be constantly vigilant about when something bad might happen, either with your mother or with your brother. And then I want to come back also to the beatings at night while you were asleep. How often did those happen from your brother?
It got better. I don't remember exactly, but I want to say between, we'll say maybe around 9 years old, because my brother was at like 2 or 3 in the morning. We had shared beds that my father had built for us that overlapped because we lived in a house and it was pretty small. And so he would just bend over in the darkness and literally bite me until I bled, and then be back in his bed and say, oh, nothing had happened. And so that was the turning point, at least, where the night attacks, the first few times it happened, my parents were like, oh, whatever. And I think my dad was much more like, no, something's really going on. Like my brother Alex, he's like, he's doing this. And they figured it out. So then I think he literally started to build an addition on the house, and then had a new bedroom for my parents downstairs. And then my brother and I had separate bedrooms. So like my father consistently did actions that were really helpful. And that's what made things kind of so confusing for many, many years, was because there'd been so much efforts to rectify things, but the damage was already, for me, neurologically done. It had already had those pivotal moments where my neuro function changed. And so I didn't have to deal with the nighttime beatings and attacks after that, because I had a lock on my door. But I did perpetually have that hypervigilance and insomnia to be listening for a sound in the middle of the night, and to be waiting, because my brother would grab me if I walked around a corner of a door and close my mouth, and then the attacks would begin. So I even, even into late teens, had to continue to be vigilant for that, because he probably had some mind body syndrome too. And he,
Yeah,
developed addiction and, out of control with alcohol and things like that.
Yeah, no doubt that he was suffering in the environment of your home as well. How many years, I assume, older than you was he?
He was a couple of days under 4 years older than me. And he killed himself when I was 18 years old, about 4 years after my mother passed away.
So, yeah, again, tremendous amount of suffering in that household. And again, the concept of growing up in a minefield where some days everything's fine and other days something blows up unexpectedly. And the result of that is that you have to be constantly vigilant. And many of my patients strive to be perfect in response to that. I don't know if this was an issue for you, but that is one way in which children try to cope with an environment like that. They try to be the absolute best little kids they can be.
I was
And if
top of my
something bad
school,
happens,
top of my college, top of my massage college. I had a quantum physics professor who told me years later he was still trying to figure out one of the questions I asked him, and he's a famous physicist. People have told me I'm really, really smart my whole life. And the insomnia used to work in my favor. In 7th grade, I read 716 adult-length books during the school year. We had to write them down. I just stay up at night and read 2 books, 2 whole adult books a night, not sleep, because it would make me safe. My brother couldn't attack me if I was awake or reading.
and a corollary to that is that many of my patients, if they make a mistake of any kind, they're very hard on themselves, much harder, much more self-critical than they would be of another person who made the same mistake. Did you notice that in yourself at all?
Absolutely. I'm a bit of a historic poster child for that. Like,
Okay.
give myself a, allowance for 0.5% of error.
That's a tough standard, Stephen. That's a very tough standard.
Yep.
All right,
And
so
and
go
direct it
ahead.
towards myself. So it's like I have loads of decades-long friends. A lot of people say they feel the safest with me they've felt with anybody in their whole life. So I really learned to self-direct all of that anger and that negativity or shame and things like that rather than pushing it onto other people, which is common in this research.
Yeah, absolutely,
Like Howard
very
said, he's like,
common.
it's a nice person's disease.
It absolutely is. But one of the treatment approaches that can be very helpful is in recognizing how much you had to overcome as a kid and giving yourself some credit that you were in this environment through no fault of your own. You had to cope with it. You survived it. And that deserves tremendous appreciation. And if you can appreciate yourself for what you've accomplished, that can ease up the pressure on being perfect, which starts a virtuous cycle of the more you can appreciate yourself, the more you can ease up on the pressure to be perfect. That brings your stress level down, which means your body doesn't have to take the hit quite so often. Have you been able to do anything like that in the course of your successful treatment?
Yep. I'm often amazed at how acceptant I am of myself at this point. Like yeah, it's become bread and butter for me. It's become so natural that it's really it's confusing for people who've known me for a long time because I'm not that kind of hard on myself anymore. Like there might be the internal, it can start. I partially I try to treat myself like I do with patients. And I just
Yeah.
recognize that, oh, you're okay. I got it. You're just being a little hard on yourself, you know?
Yeah, well, that's, you're making it sound like it's no big deal, but it is a huge deal. It is so difficult
Yeah.
to engineer an 80-degree flip in your self-image like that when you've been taught the exact opposite from the earliest of ages. It becomes a basic assumption that people carry about themselves for decades. And to be able to turn that around is a huge accomplishment. And once it's turned around, it's not going to go back. There's no reversal. It becomes who you are and makes a tremendous difference in preventing the symptoms from relapsing. Another idea that has affected many of my patients is about taking time for your own joy. Many of my patients are so focused on the needs of others and so focused on their professional work that they never get a break and they never take any time for just having a good time, just playing, just having fun, just doing something for joy. And that turns out to be an essential human skill. If you are constantly on a treadmill of working and working and working and helping others and you never stop, sooner or later your body is going to protest. Have you had any changes that you've observed in yourself along those lines?
Yes, and yes, I've had some changes. Admittedly, that's probably still an area that I'm not going to say all the way to the word struggle with, but is definitely still something I'm intently working on. I I would say that my body at this point really recognizes slowing down when I do like one of the meditations from Howard's Unlearn Your Pain book or the Curable program. I try to do one a day. If I'm feeling stressed or something like that, I'll I'll do serial. I'll do 3 or 4 in a row or something like that. And I've always been really good at, even while working a lot, getting out into the wilderness. I lived in Oregon, which just sets my heart at ease, but it's really the slowdown my brain recognizes at this point when I actually like do like a meditation or something like that. But I also much more so while I'm doing things quickly or efficiently or working a bunch, I guess it's like a walking meditation a lot, is I'm like, I might be moving quickly, but I'm not in a hurry. I've got a lot of things I'm going to do today, but it's not, there's no catastrophizing around it or something. Like when I begin my workday, because I now work for myself as a massage therapist in private practice, like I show up an hour early and I make sure that maybe I do a meditation or I just kind of sit there and look at some of the artwork in the office or things like that. Because I, during one of the major brain injuries I had, it was bad enough we had to write signs on my door like, don't walk outside, talk to the neighbors. My memory was that bad. I would walk into the traffic and stuff like that. And I read this book by a lady who'd had a severe brain injury. And long story short, she just really harped on that if you have a brain injury, no one else is going to understand what changed for you. And your number one job is to take care of yourself. And if your brain says
Mm-hmm.
lie down, lie down. And so I think of that multiple times a day, where like if I'm pushing on somebody's body and I feel a sensation in the nerves through my thumb, and I'm like, I'll just stop for a moment then, and I will. So that
Yeah,
that
that
grace
that
of allowing
concept,
myself to stop for a moment or two, or however many
yeah,
moments needed if I have to. So I've
that
gotten better.
concept of self-care is so important, and it's very often a concept that was never learned by my patients as children because they were just too busy trying to find solutions to what was going on in their households during those years. But again, it really sounds like you've been able to turn that around in a remarkably short space of time. Once you found these ideas, a tremendous load of physical symptoms, mental symptoms was turned around in a matter of, it sounds like a couple of years, which is a tribute to your mental energy and focus that you put into these ideas.
It's one of the things, I know it's irregular, though it does happen in ISTDP, but like it was literally massive 9.9 symptoms, 24 hours, less than 1 out of 10. And in the
Yeah,
last 2
that's
years, I had one time where my chronic abdominal pain, it hasn't been chronic, but I mean, it turned back on, and it was 72 hours. And it was a very discrete event where I absolutely suppressed getting angry multiple times in a row in a stressful situation. It turned back on. I was like, oh, I did that. I serial meditated for a couple of days, like 2 hours of meditating a day, just messages of self-soothing, EAT to get angry about the event, turn back off. So other than a couple of day window, it's been complete resolution.
and the one time when it did flare up, you were able to use the symptom to identify the cause. You were able to diagnose the issue that was producing it, which is obviously completely different than you were able to do before. And for our viewers who are new, ISTDP stands for Intensive Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy, and it's associated nowadays mostly with the work of Alan Abbas of Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And there's a chapter about it, and there are books about it, chapter about it in the Psychophysiologic Disorders textbook that Alan wrote for us. And he wrote a book with Howard Schubiner called Hidden from View, where those concepts are also presented. Well, this is a remarkable story, Stephen. The depths of issues that you had to cope with and the duration of them and the remarkable turnaround that you've achieved is just truly remarkable. Is there anything else that you would like to ask me or that you would like to share with our viewers before we close?
I feel like maybe the tiny share, it's just a reiteration, but something I remember Howard Schubiner and I think Mark Lumley said during the EAET course, which I took a year ago, well after I was cured, is they said people have come back to them years or decades later. And the common thing that people say is that going through the process was not as scary as they thought it was going to be. And I feel like I've seen that be some of the wording that has helped people personally in my life and professionally to kind of take the leap to begin to engage with this work. And then they are oh so grateful. And so
Yes,
I just say,
absolutely.
trust yourself. And you don't have to, but maybe harboring the potential of a potential belief that life can actually somatically, visually, psychologically, reality can feel and be completely different and more positive than anything we've ever experienced. My initial traumas were being beaten as an infant. I never learned neurologically how to actually feel like this. So it's like, I'm not like walking around as like, bliss nonstop all the time, but I'm like, I can feel things. I can react, I can respond. And it actually all happened.
Yeah, it's remarkable the potential that people can achieve with this work. I often tell my patients that what they have been through earlier in their life is significantly more difficult than the work that they still have in front of them to heal from this. And most people have found that that's the case, that they've survived a lot more challenging and traumatic experiences than the ones that will be involved in this healing pathway. So thank you for reinforcing that for our viewers. And thank you very much for sharing your story today.
Yeah. Thank you for being involved with consistent research that literally gave me a life I never thought I was going to have. Thank you, Dr. Clark. I appreciate this opportunity.
You're most welcome. All right.